What is going on out there in YouTube land? I thought I'd jump on live just now. I didn't have really much better things to do. It is raining cats and dogs outside. Stuck. So what the hell? I should probably talk to you lovely people today and do that instead. And things that are kind of on the mind this morning is that, there's so much division in the world, so much racism and tribalism in some form or the other. Crazy, man, and saddening at the same time. Sometimes entertaining, most of the time not. Seems like that's what people feed into, the algorithm rewards division. And, it just is what it is, unfortunately. Religious division, debates about homosexuality and all sorts of things. If anyone's out there, let me know if my mic is coming through okay. There has been a little problem with my audio. I'm not sure if my mic has a short in it or what's really going on. Let me chat if you notice that, right? And again, guys, like and subscribe to the channel, like this kind of content. Let me know. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Hermetic Idealism. I think that's Steven, right? Yeah, it's a little choppy, man. I don't know what that is. If it gets too bad, let me know. And I'll put a link up here after my little rant. And we can chop it up for whoever's wants to join and, have a nice conversation and all that good stuff. But, it just kind of dawns on me that we live in such a dualistic society here. Like I would say one of the greatest gifts of the human mind is not simply perception, but it's, our ability to switch perspective. Because like perception is always transient, it's immediate, very easy to disrupt it, your perception. Because, it's what we see, it's what we hear, it's what we feel, it's what we experience from where we happen to stand in some reference frame. So it's limited by nature. And, it's kind of tied to a particular point of view, like a particular history or a particular nervous system, a uniqueness about the individual, a particular identity, in other words. Every perception, of course, is filtered through that reference frame. But perspective is different because, excuse me, perspective is the mind's ability to step outside immediate experience and recognize that there are other ways of interpreting the same shared reality. It's I would call it like a cognitively transcendent capacity. I know a lot of people think that sounds very woo-woo or whatever, but it's true, guys. It's true. It allows us to understand that our experience, while genuine, it's really never the whole picture. That's all I'm saying. We begin to see that different people, different cultures, or philosophical traditions may all be describing the same underlying reality from just different reference frames, right? And this shift from perception to perspective is really one of the hallmarks of wisdom. Some of the most intelligent people lack perspective, because they love to argue from one perspective and they're not able to see. And this is probably due to an exaggerated idea of identity. You know, they're emotionally committed to like a religious idea or a philosophical idea or a political ideology, you know, or to some words like some people believe in free will, some don't. But a lot of times it's just a shift in your definition of the word free will. And if you shift that word, the meaning a little bit, perspective. For example, right? Imagine standing on opposite sides of a mountain. That's kind of like the one I like to go to. Like the other person would describe cliffs, describe forest. Who's lying? Who's telling the truth? Or is it possible that neither person is lying? You know, instead of trying to argue from your perspective, maybe try to open your mind and look at it from their perspective. Maybe they do see the forest. Neither possesses the whole mountain. That's the whole case. By transcending the limitations of each individual perspective, are we going to begin to understand the mountain itself? We have to look at all different ways of looking at it. Reality. That's all I'm saying. Like, humanity has, you know, always become trapped inside of its perceptions, mistaking, you know, the current model of reality for reality itself. Because we identify with our beliefs, our politics, our religion, our nation, our race, and even our thoughts, you know, how we think about stuff. And we're all the hero in our own story. Everybody naturally thinks that the way they think about things is the right way, while everyone else is really fucked up. That works. But once these identities become fixed, you know, our disagreement begins to feel like a threat to our existence because we have confused our perspective with who we really are. And, you know, I'm a non-dualist, so I take a particular perspective. But it's one that tries to acknowledge, you know, a larger unity. Also say it doesn't mean that differences disappear. It means that the differences exist within that larger unity. You know, from the ordinary perspective, we experience ourselves like little islands, like isolated individuals or bubbles moving through an external world, you know, which is populated by separate bubbles, separate reality bubbles, if you will, of people and objects. And this has been the dominant intuition behind many forms of, say, for example, physicalism or classical dualism, for example. Like, and I'll tell you what I mean. Like, physicalism generally, I'll get the words out this morning. Physicalism generally treats consciousness as something produced by physical processes occurring inside independently existing brains. And it's understandable. The correlations are undeniable. And to see it that way. The same thing with classical dualism. It separates mind and matter into two fundamentally different kinds of substance that somehow interact, that somehow combine, that creates like this unity of experience, the binding problem. But all of those are problems yet to be solved. And although these frameworks do differ, they both begin with something in common, and that's the separation. Now, if we shift that perspective, just shift it, the non-dual perspective would just simply begin elsewhere. It suggests that what really appears separate may instead just be an expression of an underlying relational reality. Consciousness being what it's like to be that relation. So it's more fundamental, like relations. It's the internal reality of a relation. Modern science, revealing a universe that is deeply interconnected. Like physics describes nature not through little marbles of atoms anymore, but through fields and interactions rather than these isolated billiard balls. Like that's old school. That's no longer understood in physics. Quantum entanglement, non-locality, shows that certain systems exhibit correlations that cannot be fully explained by local realism, right? And let's think about, biology. Biology reveals that organisms are ecosystems composed of countless interactions. Ecology demonstrates that no living thing exists independently of its environment at all. And if you're familiar with like systems theory and complexity science, those things like show that like what they call wholes often exhibit properties that arise from relationships among parts rather than from the parts considered in isolation, right? All of this is just non-duality. It's all just converging on that same perspective. So it encourages us to question whether our everyday assumptions and intuitions of completely separate things, really capture the deepest structure of reality, right? And, traditional wisdom traditions arrive, at similar insights long before modern science came along, like the sages and the mystics have been talking about this stuff all along. Advaita Vedanta teaches that apparent like multiplicity of the world arises within a deeper unity. This is ancient, philosophy. Buddhist teachings like on emptiness suggest that nothing possesses independent self-existing essence, that they only exist through dependent relationships. Again, consciousness is relating, to these apparent divisions. It's where we get all our meaning, values, and things like that. Taoism speaks of complementary opposites that define one another within a greater harmony. So I'm not saying that they don't differ, like these traditions don't differ. I mean, they do. I'm just saying they converge on the insight that separation is not ultimate, that perspective, and equate psychology with some overlap with spirituality because it deals with the psyche or the mind. And psychology offers another window in the same sort of spiritual way, if you really think about it. Hey, Skyworks, nice to see you, man. Thanks everybody for coming through. I know this is last minute, but got bored. It's raining outside, nothing to do, so thought I'd chat with you guys real quick. And hopefully my mic's still coming. Basically just talking about perspectives, how to look at reality from different ways in a way that's hopefully useful and positive. Like I said, psychology and modern cognitive science, for example, increasingly views the self not as like this permanent entity, but as a dynamic construction, continuously sort of updated model of self generated through memory, perception, prediction, language, and attention. And don't get me wrong, like the self is extraordinarily useful and I engage in it. Everybody does. The ego is extremely useful. It's a survival mechanism. It's a tool for survival. You know, if I didn't have an ego, I wouldn't know which mouth to put the fork. But, you know, usefulness is not the same as fundamentality. You know, I go back to Kastrup's, like a whirlpool in a river. The self has a recognizable form, you know, without existing independently from the processes from which it arises, right? It's all interconnected. Brain function, the environment, the nervous system, the body, the entirety of reality, actually, all the way back to the Big Bang. All of this stuff is connected causally. You know, but even causation is sort of not fundamental, as it turns out, not so fundamental. There's just the relations. The stories we tell about the relations are arising from the physical mind. The constraint, that constraint of the mind. This is why it's so easy to get locked into our perceptions of the world. And it's so easy for the ego to want to adapt to an identity that ties itself to that perception. It's a lot harder to exercise a little perspective and nuance on these things. And, you know, recognizing this really changes how we relate to ourselves and to one another. That's the thing. If I'm not an isolated island standing apart from the rest of existence, then neither are you. So that boundary between self and other becomes less absolute. And it just seems that compassion, because another person's suffering is no longer viewed as entirely separate from my own. And that's really the benefit of it. You know, it can kind of break down the walls of tribalism and racism and bigotry, us against them. You know, these things become easier to break down. Humility becomes natural because my recognized as one viewpoint among many rather than just the final word on reality. So dialogue is going to replace that sort of domination. Curiosity and skepticism is going to replace certainty. You know, that understanding, like I said, it replaces tribalism. This does not eliminate disagreement, nor should it. My perspective here does not require anybody to abandon reason, science, critical thinking, quite the opposite. It asks us to remember the difference between our models and reality itself, and to continue to search and continue to take seriously other perspectives and question them and examine them skeptically and see where we all may land as individuals. But to remain open at the same time. It only, you know, asks that, you know, we remember that every description is just a map. It's not the territory. Every perspective sort of illuminates something while leaving something else in shadow, right? And so perhaps the deepest value of this non-dual kind of perspective is not that it answers every metaphysical question, Its value is how it transforms the one who's asking the question. So when we loosen our attachment to these rigid identities, believe these boundaries, then we discover a quieter mind, more peace of mind, more peace with others, a more open relationship to the world. Conflict loses a lot of its fuel because there's less need to defend like this image of ourself, like our identity. And fear softens because the isolated self, like that we're all struggling to protect, is going to be seen more like a dynamic process rather than a permanent possession. And, at the societal level, this shift, I imagine, could be very profound if everybody really saw it that way. Like many of humanity's conflicts arise from this exaggerated division, like nation against nation, race against race, religion against religion, ideologies against other ideologies. A non-dual perspective, it's not going to erase these differences, like I said, nor should it. If everyone agreed, then somebody would have to be dishonest here because disagreement is just normal. But it puts that in its place. It places them within a larger context of shared existence, right? It'll remind us that beneath many identities, still we participate in that same unfolding reality, and we're all connected. We're all dependent. Perhaps, the wisdom is not found by clinging ever more tightly to our perspective. Perhaps wisdom that these perspectives itself is the bridge beyond perception. And so perhaps non-duality is not merely another philosophy competing for our allegiance. Perhaps it's the invitation to see what appears divided and how those always belong really to the deeper whole, right? And yeah, it seems obvious, Skyworks. It is to me. It is to me too. But unfortunately, people get into arguing over their perceptions, the way they perceive their perspective as the only truth or the most obvious truth, or you're wrong or you're morally bankrupt because you don't agree with a particular perception. There's so much division in the world, regardless of how obvious it seems. I think most people know this. This is why, even before religions came along, that acknowledgement of non-duality. Non-duality really is clear if you just look past your nose a little bit, because it's right there in front of you. But unfortunately, we all engage in ego. We all get very naturally caught up in our identities and our brainwashing and influences and these things. And it takes a lot of practice. This is why I look at non-dualism as not just a perspective, but also a practice, because you have to really practice it in order to be reminded about these things. When the perspective is, number one, on an individual level, like you can imagine contemplation, meditation, research, going inward. But then you can look at the external practice, which is to treat others as yourself, trying to be helpful in as many ways as you can. Things like that. And that's really where the value is on that level. Where we differ is what we believe is the ground of being. Yeah, well, I think it's very obvious to me, but I understand to you, it may, you see it differently. That's okay. It's not that important, actually, what we consider these models of reality, the grounding. I think the one thing we can all agree on is that our most immediate and direct reality is going to be the thing we perceive as an agent. You know, our internal reality, as well as the perception of the quote unquote outside world. It all exists within. You know, your perceptions exist in your mind. So I think that's what we can all pretty much agree with. Neuroscience, like I said before, everything converges on that the self is a construct. So if it is, so then who is the observer? Who is the one? If it's not, because whatever identity we create, it's a creation, right? There's just the experience. There's just this process of experiencing, and experiences change. They're transient, and we notice that, we observe it, and we can talk about it. But that self is a construct. There is no self. When you start putting the self away, if you can shift your perspective, you can understand where I'm coming from, which is to say, all you have direct access to is consciousness, you know, an awareness of all these experiences. That's really what it is, you know, when you say being, ground of being, well, the ground of being is awareness in my perspective, because it's all I really know. Anything after that is just more thinking. And we know that the brain is constrained. The physical mind is constrained by limitation and perspective. You know, you're stuck in a reference frame. But we do perceive firsthand, we all share in these relations, how everything relates to everything else, and we can model our reality after those relations. So it seems like the relations are more fundamental than the way we think about through causation and these sort of explanations that the mind likes to entertain. Yeah, words are constructs. Exactly. That's exactly what I'm saying. They're all just constructs. Just like the self. All of that. Yep. Very useful, very meaningful. This duality that I'm talking about is, I embrace it 100%. That's the whole thing. Because I'm able to step out of that perspective of non-duality and also 100% agree with duality in its meaning. It's wonderful. It's where we get to express ourselves, you know, through all of this duality. It's how we relate from one thing to another. The subject-object split is part of our experience, is what we're aware of. You know, and these things change, they're transient, but they're still real. But that experience of it, the awareness of all that stuff goes on in our lives. You know, that same awareness when you were just an infant is the same awareness you are today. It's the same thing we are engaged in. And these languages, it seems kind of contrary because, like you say, words are constructs themselves. So they kind of self-refute. Whenever you try to explain non-duality with words, it always falls short because we use dualistic language, right? Because dualism is so intuitive. Let's see. That doesn't mean that you don't exist as an individual in a wider world temporarily. Not at all. As I was saying before, we all exist as individuals in our experience, and it's where we gain all of our meaning. It's the subject. It's called subjectivity. I don't have access to your first person subjective experience and vice versa. That's true. That is very true. Stephen G, how's it going, brother? Quantum boundary is self. Self exchanges words just as quantum boundaries of self exchange words as particle. Yeah, that's one way to see it. But all of these boundaries exist within our experience, right? It's still perceptual. Stephen says self is a perceptual boundary, right? It's all perceptual. That's the point here. And yeah, man, it's a way that we can look at things also too. You know, it's not just about, you know, kind of discovering your awareness and discovering those sort of things, but also like how we can relate to the world at large and try to be a positive force in the world. You know, which is sort of, I don't know how you guys might see it. Maybe you want to drop links, or actually I'll invite people on stage too. But this thing about free will, you know, sorry about that, guys. Man, thunderstorm knocked my shit out for a minute. Sorry about that. But some interesting stuff. Let's see, what are you saying here? The you that is you exists for a finite time unless you consider yourself the universe itself or something that arises in the universe. Yeah, good statement there. The you, yeah, exists for a finite time under one perspective because it's a construct. And once the physical mind dies out, it dies, you know, we all grow old and we all die, then that you no longer exists, does it? Because there's no you to be aware of anymore. That you died, right? It no longer exists. But what is the you then? What is this process of awareness? Well, it's natural. It's a natural thing, right? So we are sort of a process, a temporary, finite, existing process in nature. But nature is existence, you know, the nature of reality. I don't know if reality began to exist. I sort of assumed that, you know, if I put my thinking cap on, I would say it could be eternal. And in that case, if you identify with nature, the reality of nature, the nature of reality, or the essence of reality, then essentially you live forever, but not in the way that your ego, your physical mind exists forever. So it really doesn't, it's kind of semantics there in that case. A disassociated alter or conscious agent is a perceptual boundary causing the egocentric perspective. Exactly. I agree with that 100%. Free will involves choice of observation, which modifies quantum boundaries, which maintain persistence through particle emergence. Maybe I don't know enough about that stuff to speak on it with any authority. I'm not a scientist in any way, I just know from my own experience, like when I meditate, the whole idea when I meditate is to stop thinking, but I never can, because the thinking involuntarily appears in my mind's eye. All these thoughts, memories, everything just appear, not without any volitional intention. So I don't have any free will over my thoughts. And I can extend that out to all my priors of my physical being, everything like that, my situation, the time I was born. There's a lot of priors that sort of constrain my free will. But I don't look at free will as just illusory. I feel like free will is useful, and you can have a form of free will. If you define free will as the ability to do what you want within those constraints, then sure, I don't have a problem with free will. And I exercise it every day. You know, it's sort of like you have intellectual beliefs and then you have embodied beliefs. Look, when I go out my door, I look both ways before I cross the street every day. If I really believe that everything was determined and I'm just going to get hit by a truck when my time comes, then why look both ways? Just, you know, but the fact is, I feel like I am determined to believe in free will. I'm determined to act the way I do, which is as though I have free will. And maybe I do in some perspective. So I don't get hung up on the semantics. I kind of look at every perspective as useful. Yeah. Oh, a constant flow of becoming sustains the appearance of fixed being. Yeah. Like the currents in the ocean. Self is like currents in the ocean. Yeah, they're here for a time and then they dissipate, but it's all made of the same water. I can believe I'm the universe, an aspect of it. I and you still need to navigate our way through it and make decisions as to how we approach particular tasks in effect. Outcomes. Yes, that's what I'm saying. We can't help it. We it's almost like we have to. Even if we tried to say, you know what, I'm going to prove it. I'm not going to make a choice. I'm going to prove free will is bullshit. I'm not going to choose to navigate anything. I'm just going to do nothing. Well, that's a choice. That is a form of navigation. You know what I mean? Like, there's no way around it. You know, we do what we do as an unfolding of nature. Our will, our choices are the unfolding of nature. If you could go back in time, let's say last year when you made some decision you regretted, it's easy to say, you know, if I could just go back in time, I would do things differently. But remember, you didn't have the advantage of knowing what you know now. You would be in the same state of mind back then that you had back then, right? You can't, if you could go back in time, you would be that person. So you would make the same decision, it seems. I don't see how you would make a different decision if you were in the same process of unfolding. You know, you would be in that same state. So don't beat yourself up. You know, just, you know, you're going to learn from your mistakes and hopefully you're going to get better and evolve and change. That's the only thing constant here. Not clinging to the dissociation and allowing it to arise and dissipate as it will is liberation from fear. Thank you, man. Such a good way to put it, man. You always have really good ways of communicating ideas. I really like on your channel, how you compose your ideas. I really enjoy it. I've learned so much about it, and I benefit from that. I really like different perspectives, you know, those that I agree with and those that I don't. You know, as long as they're laid out properly, then you know, I benefit from it. But I can't really say I benefit from those sort of ideas that are incoherent to me. I would just need them to be broken down, and you just have to make it make sense. Like, I understand the perspective from, like, say, physicalism. I understand that perspective, but because I understand a lot more about the other perspectives, like, and I understand the problems that are laid out even by the physicalists themselves, then I can take a more nuanced approach, and it's just going to land with me where it does. Now, other people could disagree, and that's fine. Hopefully they will be open to looking at the problems. You know what I mean? And then entertaining other perspectives. You don't have to agree, but just try to understand, Thanks, brother. I hold you high regard and enjoy the direction of this channel. Thank you, man. Thank you. Yeah, because I like how, you have your whiteboard. I really wish I had a whiteboard too. That makes things easier to illustrate for people. So I like how you write out your, flow charts and decision trees and things like that. It's really helps things out, and it helps break your concepts down, And I've got the link, in the live chat. So if anybody wants to jump on, conversate, it's all, I understand. Shit. I just wanted to kind of ramble on with some thoughts and share it with you guys today. So yeah, but I was just talking about free will with someone else who is an advocate for free will, but in the sense that, free will being defined a particular kind of way, like freedom to act within the constraints, to do what you want. And I don't have a problem with that. It's the libertarian free will that I have a problem with, not because I'm opposed to it for any particular identification reason, but I resist it, or I question it, or I'm skeptical about it because my own experience shows me different. I can't change, all my priors of who I am. I cannot go back in time to change my decisions, and I can't see how I could, even theoretically, unless I was put on another timeline, in which case, you're advocating for a multiverse, which is another belief system. So it's like a lot of beliefs that have to be assumed in order to make free will work in that way, right? And I try not to assume too many beliefs, because it's easy to get, caught up in, like a unparsimonious sort of construction of the mind. You have to assume all these, you have to assume an infinite amount of universes just to explain one and the way it works, which could be true. I'm not opposed to that. That could be the case. That would be wild if it was. I would be on board. But we need evidence. We need some sort of reason to believe that's the case. And I understand that there's very mathematically precise descriptions, but there's also mathematically precise descriptions of alternative views. So it's underdetermined. Logically, it's underdetermined. And if it's underdetermined, I think the most parsimonious view is to say, I don't know. And there's nothing wrong with saying you don't know. Meanwhile, we all sort of come up with conclusions or perspectives. I try to make mine tentative until more evidence comes along to sway me in one direction over the other. It's like the whole God thing. Believing in God, on one perspective can be very understandable. But there are other problems that I have. Like, for me, the biggest one would be things like divine hiddenness, the problem of evil, and then really mainly just defining what God is. I guess you'd have to define what you mean by God. And I could I believe in Brahma. I don't have a problem with that kind of God, or Spinoza's God or anything like that. I don't have a problem with that. And in that case, you could say I'm a theist or a deist or something like that, right? But I don't identify with that label because I know labels sort of box you in. And I would rather advocate for an open mind, to be skeptical, to see things from different points of view, and acknowledge where things are underdetermined. That's just me, though. This is tricky because it always lands as free will and determinism. If the lower self is always determined in actions, it has originate as freely willed from a higher self, causing the determinism. Yeah, like nature unfolding, say that the higher self is the natural world from which my process of, the physical mind or the brain or whatever, that operation arises. But all of that is still a construct, isn't it? It's all still just an observation of consciousness, isn't it? It's all sort of a relative thing based on a perspective, and it's fine. And as long as it works, if understanding more about the physical mind can lead to helping people overcome problems and curing, diseases or curing, then it's helpful, it's useful. Now that still doesn't prove it's metaphysically true. I acknowledge that, but it still has value. And that's why I don't discount dualism. I don't discount physicalism, or really, I wouldn't say physicalism, but I don't have a problem with the physical. The physical is just what can be objectively or intersubjectively described and measured and predicted on. That's what I mean by physical. Obviously, that is stuff that we can all agree on. I mean, we do that every day, right? We predict the weather. We have this subject object split that we have to contend with daily. I acknowledge all that. I don't have a problem with any of that. Neither should we. Mal, freely willed, DA determined. Okay, that's cool, man. Yeah, so it's our reality is strange. First of all, nothing really surprises me. Like, we get into these, I've been hearing a lot about, like, say, the UAP phenomenon. A lot of people look at the same data that, like, the government is exposing. For example, like these blurry photographs and videos and things online you can look at, anecdotes and stories. Some people look at this as evidence for aliens from other universes coming in. Other people look at this as evidence of, exaggerated claims, misidentified objects in the sky, like atmospheric conditions, more mundane explanations that are being ignored, but only perceived through one perspective of aliens, interdimensional creatures, time travelers. Some see it as hoaxes. Some see it as a combination of hoaxes and misidentification and illusions and things like that. It seems undetermined from one point of view. But if it turned out to be aliens, I would not be surprised at all. If it turned out that it was all just misidentification or high-tech stuff from other countries or what, I would not be surprised at all. Now, I would kind of be surprised that we don't see a lot of these UAPs in our wars. It seems like if we had this kind of technology, why would we be contending with Iran the way we are? It seems like Trump would just send in all these UAPs that we call UAPs, like these Tic Tacs and things like that. And it would be world domination. It would be game over if this was somebody's tech. Because look, if they can go from, outer space pretty much all the way to sea level on the earth in a split second, then that's amazing power. That's like magic. But another perspective is none of that is true. None of that. It's just misidentification. It's a mistake. And look, airline pilots, jet pilots can get just as affected by delusions and illusions as anybody else is. Nell, how you doing, girl? She says, I'm agnostic when it comes to what fundamental reality is really made of. It could be purely physical stuff. It could be purely consciousness. Perhaps both are fundamental, right? And that's where the models are, that they're underdetermined. It could be structural stuff. It could be neutral stuff. I don't pretend to know, but it all fascinating. I enjoy looking into philosophy of mind and neuroscience. Yeah. Good point on the world war issue. Right. They had that stuff. They would be implementing it. No doubt. Diving into different metaphysical models is enlightening. It is. And it's good for your intellect. It's good for your humility, exercise of epistemology, and things like that. Like it's a real good intellectual exercise to engage in, I think. And, the mind is very adaptive. So once you start getting into making it a habit to look into those things, you find it sort of addictive. It's sort of like a fun thing to do. It's like if you've made it your habit to come home and just turn on TV until you go to bed, you're going to do that all night long. Mine is to look at metaphysics and philosophy and things like that. That's the kind of stuff that engages me. But I used to be a big time TV addict and entertainment addict, and it just kind of burns you out after you have enough experiences in travel and entertainment and pursuing relationships with like women and sex. And I mean, if you do that stuff enough, I'm telling you, it will burn you out, because the mind is highly adaptive. It starts to lose its appeal, its novelty. But one thing that for me really doesn't is the practice of non-duality, because it's so challenging every day to try to be a good person, to challenge yourself, to be peaceful with others, even when you're irritated or impatient. These things are challenging. Trying to sit down and meditate for long periods of time, to go out and exercise or get yourself into a flow state, because the payoffs are just so fun and great, but they're just rare enough to keep you on the loop. Where all this stuff like social media, doom scrolling and TV watching and entertainment, that stuff is so immediate and accessible. It's easy to burn out with it. It's so easy to burn out. But it's so cool when you can, engage in philosophy and spirituality and things of that nature. And I know a lot of people cringe when you say those sort of words or whatever, but try it, man. Like, get out of your comfort zone. Understand that your brain is just very adaptive, and you've adapted into maybe a perspective. You've adapted into your perception, which has been influenced by echo chambers, mentality. Challenge yourself. Try to listen to music you really don't like. I do that too. Like, I usually don't like country music. So that's why I started listening to it. And it just demonstrates how adaptive your mind can be. You can really get into anything, and it all expands your consciousness. You start to discover new pleasures. You discover new enjoyment in positive things. And this is good. This is what life's about. Not being stuck in one little perspective. It's cool how we've now extended metacognition to more than just humans. A lot of higher mammals seem to be metacognitive. Yeah, in fact, if you could pull some stuff up, that would be kind of cool to look at. But I believe that. And I forget which animals those are. It's been a while since I looked into that. But one of the things I want to do, like being Sophia, like looking at some of the things that are going on around the world, like ideas and especially social kind of movements, political ideologies, things like that. I want to start looking at that stuff from a non-dual perspective, at least entertain these things and look at them for what they are. And then, you know, just kind of see for yourself what I mean about the division and the tribalism. Like yesterday, we were talking about like that argument between Christianity and Islam, like which one creates a better world. And you can see the dualism play out, and you can see the limitation right there in front of you. You see the absurdity of it all, you know? And these people are they take their perspectives very serious because they've identified with all that stuff, you know? But it's so easy to see the harm and the potential harm, and how you can see why wars are waged and fights are had over these sort of perspectives that really don't reflect reality. If you think about it, reality is bigger than our religions. Reality is bigger than our modeling, you know? Those are just perspectives, and they may be meaningful in everything from one perspective, but there's a whole world out there, you know what I mean? And think about the negativity that comes from such tribalism and division. Is it really worth it? Is there a better way? Dolphins and primates. Yeah. Higher evolved animals. Exactly. You know, the physical mind, for them, you know, they have their own Umwelt. You know, they see things in their own way, more like humans, because we have that frontal, that neocortex and everything. New biology is consciousness going all the way down. Yeah, I noticed that. You know, or theory, like the quantum consciousness stuff. You know, we looked at Donald Hoffman's phase theory of perception when he was on with Neil deGrasse Tyson on Star Talk. Yeah, that was consciousness first theory. You've got integrated information theory, which takes consciousness as a given and then seeks to explain how consciousness interacts with systems that have a level of phi, which is a measurement of experience. Yeah, there's a lot of these theories coming out, a lot of these models. Christian and Muslim apologists were married to dualism without the benefit of non-dual insight. Exactly. And that's why it all see. But you know, these people, they love their dualism. They get off because it's fun. It really, dualism is a lot of fun. That's why we have it. You know, they love to see the enemy. They love the war. They love the drama, the back and forth. It promotes their identity and group dynamics. And look, we're social animals. As social animals, we seek to survive within groups. And that's why it's so important for us to be tribal, to figure out where we fit into these hierarchies. But these are very ancient ways of looking at the world, very religious ways of looking at the world for very base reasons, very survival, instinctual reasons. But we can transcend it. We can transcend. I mean, that's the whole point of evolving and changing, is that we can grow in our knowledge and grow in philosophy that, you know, there's a bigger world and it's all interconnected. We can all see that. Yeah, all cells being conscious. Yeah, you're right. That reminds me of Michael Levin's work, which pretty much establishes those things. Yeah, Michael Levin. Levin sees active inference in below the cellular level, right? And he sort of demonstrated that in so many ways. So yeah, science is always looking at consciousness more and more as a fundamental thing. More and more. It's great that this is now coming to the surface in the hard sciences. Yeah, it really is. And if it can promote a more non-dualist sort of attitude within society, I think it would be positive. I think there would be more, we would be more open to, breaking down the walls of division with each other, because we would see each other as one thing, ultimately. And a lot of people are scared of the idea of religious thinking, but one of the ways about religion is it does bind people into some concepts. Now, a lot of these religious concepts are very dualistic, very harmful. But what if these views could be non-dualistic? What if they could promote the opposite? Then people who leave these dualistic like Christianity, these sort of things, because one of the things that we complain about is like the meaning crisis, because people are more and more, losing their religion. But then, they kind of gravitate towards nihilism or depression or something negative in many cases. Not always, not me. Maybe a little bit, I guess. At the beginning, I was an angry atheist. But, if you could find a home with something that can give you just as much community, just as much awe in reality, that could replace the God, that could replace the magic with something more realistic, but that's just as, awe-inspiring, I think it could be useful. Wouldn't be for everybody. And the other thing I would say is that non-dualism is not for everyone. It can be destabilizing for people, because a lot of people are just so into their dualistic thinking. It becomes so second nature that they get disoriented. If they really take that seriously, they become, even suicidal. A lot of people take direction from science, says so. This is good. Yeah, they do. I was just bringing that out earlier. That, relativity, the B theory of time, block universe, entanglement / non-locality, all of these things support a non-dual view of reality. Hoffman's non-dual scientific idealism really sets the stage for this, then flows into Levin's cellular consciousness focus. Yes, it really does. It really does. Now, a lot of panpsychists will argue that actually this stuff also supports panpsychism, but we have to acknowledge the problems, just the logical problems with it all, and the fact that we're still assuming physicality as a thing that has its own standalone existence. That's a huge assumption. So that for some turns people off or presents a problem. But that's not to say it isn't possible. It isn't to say that it isn't possible, because we may lack a lot of information. So I'm open to it. But for me, I'm more lean towards idealism. If I have to pick a model, I do lean more towards that, only because I start with consciousness. It's what I'm stuck in. So I can't really say for sure that there's this outside world that's made of these standalone properties. Measurable, intersubjective, external, and able to be predicted upon. All of that's very useful, but logically, usefulness doesn't equal metaphysical truth, right? It just means it's useful. Like I had a dream last night that I was able to survive an airplane crash because I was able to use the airplane gadgets to land it safely. And I'm not a pilot. I know nothing about that shit. But in my dream, I did. And it was very useful to have learned how to use those navigation tools. But just because it was useful in my dream doesn't make it not a dream, right? So usefulness does not equate to ontological reality. You know what I'm saying? Idealism, non-dualism, panpsychism is dualistic. Physicalism is dualistic. Exactly. That's my thing. Idealism is non-dual because it's combining the experience with, your experience. Everything in the experience is in the experience. And I think that's undeniable. And so that sort of just leads me down the route of non-dualism, which leads me down the route of idealism. Non-dualists accept all, even seeing the dual perspective. Right, exactly. That's what I was talking about. I find the meaning in dualism and I embrace it 100%. 100%. Why we need to eat. Exactly. Skyworks, I'm still of the opinion that idealism is just a fanciful belief that some find attractive or profitable. Yeah, it can be. And like I say, idealism, physicalism, panpsychism, all of these are models. And all our models are just a reflection of the limited physical brain, the mind, or the physical mind, rather. That's all it is. It's just a reflection of our limitation. All these sort of guesses and what makes sense to us. The is under no obligation to make sense to us, as Neil deGrasse Tyson says. I agree with that. But if we're going to play by the same rules, if logic is our rule set, so to speak, and we do want to engage in model making, which I don't have a problem with. I find it very fun, fascinating. I would lean towards idealism for all the reasons I mentioned. Idealism is based on the number one thing we know primarily, which is awareness. And awareness is not transient at all, especially in comparison to thinking and thoughts and model making and experiences. All those things come and go. They change constantly, right? But awareness is where all that stuff fits into. It's where you observe the experiences, is in an awareness, right? And idealism is just to say that awareness is unlimited in that way. And it's fundamental to all your experiences, all your science, all the things that we do cognitively and experientially. Everything is experience. Even science is an exercise in experience. Empirical evidence, empiricism. What does empirical mean? It's based on intersubjective experiences, what we all can subjectively experience together in a shared reality of it. But we're all stuck in our experience. We're never outside of it. It just seems very intuitive to think that our experiences reflect reality as it really is. Yep, it is what you are doing now. Exactly, man. Doing these podcasts is engaging in dualism. That is exactly right. Landing this philosophical plane in this live chat now. By profitable, I mean materialistically. Oh, yeah, absolutely. You can make money doing that. Yeah. Yep. In a monetary sense. Exactly. I was actually approached by a professional coach trainer who was a big time radio host. I'm not going to share his name, but he was a nationwide radio host, had his own podcast, and he charged people for advice. And I was put onto him through a contact that I had in the music industry. I'm involved in the music industry for years. And he said, well, look, man, since you're doing these podcasts, let me put you on with this guy. He may have some direction to help you. And yeah, this person coached me, free session. And he says, topics, if you really want to make your channel blow up, you need to do more paranormal stuff. Talk about spirits and ghosts and souls and psychic ESP. That's what people want to hear about. Life after death stories. Especially with your experience with IANDS, the International Association of Near-Death Studies. You could start getting with near-death experience. You could. I'm sorry, guys. This knocking me out. Oh, hopefully I didn't lose you guys for too long. But yeah, like I said, I was approached and it made sense. You know, I could do all that to try to boost this channel and make money. But I don't want to do that. I'd rather keep it real and talk about the things I do know, my own knowledge base. And so I don't make any money, you know, because I chose to go this direction instead of trying to talk about things I don't know about, like life after death, ghosts, spirits, things like that. I've heard a lot of stories, never experienced anything myself. I mean, I love talking about near-death experience because it is part of my wheelhouse, because I used to do work with IANDS, the International Association of Near-Death Studies. And so I talked to a lot of people. I gathered a lot of data points, but it's never been part of my experience. And there's all kinds of ways to interpret this stuff. So don't find it very honest of me to engage in paranormal channels if I really don't believe it. You know what I mean? That kind of makes me feel kind of like, or something like that. And I'm trying to keep it real always. You know, I'm trying to just talk about what's really on my mind. I do this stuff for fun, as a hobby. You know, I do this stuff for the passion, for the love of the game. And if you like what I do, please like and subscribe if you're new to the channel. Please do. It helps because I want to grow the community. If I ever did, I would love to make this my business if I could, but I can't really expect that to be the case. I kind of just do it for the love of the game for now, you know, and let what happens happen. Now, yeah, in so many ways, yeah, it's like consciousness is the way that reality dreams and sees itself through a dream or an illusion, a delusion of a limited physical brain, mind, whatever. But is it possible that consciousness goes deeper than emergence? And I believe that it's worth talking about seriously. So do I. That's the whole thing. And physicalism still falls short of answering the hard problems of consciousness. Right. And the hard problem of consciousness really is hard. Like, I've tried to solve it. I've tried to really look, and I can't do it. I mean, there's greater minds than me that have failed. And it's not anything new. This is called the mind-body problem. And it's hundreds of years old. You know, actually thousands, because if you look at, like I said, the Advaita Vedanta, you know, this is what leads them to that conclusion of a consciousness first sort of worldview perspective, you know, because of that problem. It's just that you got to understand dualism is very intuitive. It's very hard for people to wrap their heads around non-dualism or consciousness first stuff. Very hard, because culturally it is ingrained in our culture, in our upbringing. And plus we have object permanence, which is a natural evolutionary tool. You know, we have to survive by seeing reality a certain way. But just by interpreting reality a certain way doesn't give us the truth about reality. That's why we can say other animals that we share space with are aware of the external world in totally different ways. You know, bats use sonar and stuff like that to perceive the world. Other people are colorblind. Some aren't. Some are synesthetics. They see in colors, or they see numbers for colors, or numbers for anything, buildings, stuff like that. It's really weird stuff. So perception is really relative to the kind of observer that is, you know, observing the world in that way. Understandings are developed and act as a library from which to draw from and expand upon. Right. That's why it's useful if we do it right. If we can understand things correctly and we can be logical, then we can draw from and expand upon. That's what science aims to do. It's like, you know, Newton had a particular understanding about things, about gravity and things of this nature. But then Einstein came along and expanded on that, became deeper. And then quantum mechanics became deeper to understand reality, you know. But it doesn't make Newtonian mechanics wrong. It's just from another perspective. From like the very large, you have relativity. From the very small, you have quantum mechanics, which all work on different sort of rule sets. All right. Ideas develop and become refined, and further learning and become part of the bank of knowledge and beliefs. Right. That's what they do. That's what they do. I don't disagree with that. But again, usefulness, utility is not the same as ontological truth. You can have both things true at the same time. You can have a dualistic world, a dualistic physical world that's useful and real in that way, and then non-dualism also be true. Idealism also be true. One does not exclude the other necessarily, only unless we talking about ontology. You know, physicalism cannot live alongside idealism because these are ontological views. But the physical world and science and the method of methodological naturalism can be useful and helpful. Studying physics, cosmology, chemistry, and evolutionary biology didn't deaden the universe for me. It did the exact opposite, right? But, you know, a lot of people will say that that's just sexed up, because basically what you'd be doing there is pantheism, like seeing the spiritual quality of the universe. And a lot of people say, no, there's just cold, dead matter that doesn't care about anything. Like Richard Dawkins used to say that. There's just a cold, uncaring universe. There's no meaning in it at all. But that's forgetting that we as subjects are part of the same nature. We are meaning makers. Cosmology and physics show us that every atom in our body was forged in the heart of dying stars. Yeah. Yeah, that's non-dualism as well. And on a physical sort of aspect, you know what I mean? Like we are the universe. Biology and evolution prove that we aren't separate entities placed into an environment. We grow out of it like, thank you. Nell, you understand this stuff really good. I'm so glad you do. We are not outside of nature. We come out of nature. We are an expression of nature, physically and consciously. You know what I mean? We are literally a part of nature that evolved to experience love, beauty, justice, our capacity to create meaning in nature experiencing itself. See, now you sound like Sadhguru. Very spiritual takes, man. These are very excellent ways of talking about transcendence. Because, you know, as far as I know, rocks and sand and things like that, atoms and photons, they don't experience anything like love, beauty, justice, capacity to create meaning. All of that stuff is how we as conscious beings are able to transcend and sort of go beyond just the billiard ball mechanics of things. Existence are always existence itself, embodied or incarnate, engaged in doing of self-experience. Yeah, because experience is the process by which we know anything about the physical world, if you will. I mean, that's the primary basis of epistemology, is the fact that we are experiencing an existence and an observation of the world. We're observers. So, you know, and I just think it's kind of transcendent when we can admit that our experiences aren't the whole story. They're just aspects, perspectives from a reference frame, a very local reference frame. But even from there, because we're so intelligent, we can derive and readily, like Skyworks says, it becomes obvious that, you know, it's all just one thing. It's all just sort of disconnected ultimately. Like it becomes obvious. Skyworks said that, and he was right. But actually, some people, unfortunately, don't see it that way, believe it or not. They're so hung up and trapped into their dualistic egos and self narratives, they can't get outside of themselves because they're constantly in their own way. You know, and a lot of it has to do with interest. They're just not interested in seeing the world any other way. And that's fine. That's just nature unfolding the way it will for them. Not everyone is the same. Not everyone wants to think about philosophy or metaphysics or anything like that. Not everyone is inclined to be that introspective and, you know, curious about things like that. Some people would rather just be told what to believe by authorities. They would rather just, you know, take the popular views because it's easier. And then some people want to club other people over the head with those popular views when they find people that disagree with the popular view. Why? Because it supports their ego narrative. It supports their place in the hierarchies. They become the champion of worldviews, of what's popular, what's rational. You know, they get their rationality by what they've been told is the more rational thing to believe, like God or their religion or their worldview model, or whatever it is. Those are the things that they've been taught. And sometimes they don't even realize they've been taught these things. They don't even realize that they're operating from priors that they're not conscious of all the time. They don't have the free will they think they do. They're just there to regurgitate ideas. And they can't help it, and it's fine. And for some, they do it on purpose. Some say, yeah, I understand I can look at things different, but I don't want to, for whatever reason. This all lead me to embrace non-duality, no dogmatic beliefs required. Yes, that's right. And it just seems more rational to me. It seems so obvious. I'm doing bench press at the gym and streaming the talk. Oh, man, good. Put one in for me, brother. I need to go to the gym, too. It's been a while. Thinking about the consciousness of cells as I pump weight. Yeah, imagine you're killing a lot of cells when you breathe in so much oxygen, too. You're burning up cells, which is helping you to, exert energy. You're exerting energy. The laws of physics are free will of all cells. The laws of physics are free will of all cells. Sounds cool, but maybe you could break it down. Or you can, guys, anybody can call in if they have any thoughts. Yeah. But yeah, man. Perspectives are just a way to transcend our perception, which I think is what science attempts to do, right? Science goes through a lot of work to get out of their perceptions, right? They create tools, but at the end of the day, you have to perceive through your tools. You still have to look at things through a perception. So while it is expanding your view of this physical world, which I think is just a construct, it's just an appearance of the way things are, according to the kind of, like Donald Hoffman would say, which I agree with, a kind of interface. Our minds are a kind of interface to the world. It's how we perceive it. We know this is true because of evolutionary game theory. We can see that different creatures interpret the world in totally different ways, in ways that benefit them for fitness payoffs, not for ontological truth. So that's why I embrace that, because I think that also is very obvious if you really think about it. I mean, this goes back hundreds of years, with Kant, the phenomena versus the noumena. We don't have direct access to external reality as it is, but we do have access to it through the noumena, our experiential interface. I think this is a rational perspective, and it leads to non-dualism. I see medicine as conscious medicine which communicates to the conscious inner body, so to speak. And I think that viewing medicine as conscious medicine in Levin's sense, yeah, I think I know what you're talking about. Like, you mean like kind of like how medicine is a placebo in some ways. Like your consciousness, how it's communicating to your cells and things like that, like your experience. I mean, this kind of makes sense because, you think about the principle of neuroplasticity. The idea that your learning and your experiences can sort of ingress upon, like deep trenches and pathways, neural pathways of the brain. Like there's sort of a top-down sort of causation, if you will. And it also affects your immune system. We already know that, like your state of mind can affect your immune system. If you're always sad, depressed, and angry, you can fall into a very weak immune system from what I understand. But if you raise your consciousness to be more positive somehow, and I guess this would be through like physiology, then it can actually change your physical outcome. Like it's all interplay. It's an interplay. It's a dance. Like, you know, if I wake up in the morning groggy, impatient, irritated, in a bad mood, I can choose to maybe do some light exercises to bring me out of that, and then eat like a good meal, drink, you know, water, juice, vitamins, and then all of that stuff combined can make me more positive minded. And then my positive mind can get me to be motivated to do things. And then learning things, experience things, can develop new habits, more neural pathways in my mind. And then doing the hard work becomes easier. It's easier to think about things you always think about than it is to not do that, right? So if you can create habits, you can impress upon your body, which makes doing particular things easier. And this is where a sense of free will may come in, you know, like a long-term benefit. Could revolutionize medicine, Levin's solution to cancer? Yeah, it's like a form of communication. Like you can actually talk to the cells, and you can communicate them in such a way that they can override a lot of the basic processes that are not structures in the genes and the DNA, but rather like epigenetics, like stuff over the genes. And cells are very intelligent, so they can forge novel ways and goal setting in order to achieve what it is that they want. You know what I mean? And we can intervene in that process. In fact, he's demonstrated that through tetrabots and xenobots and anthrobots, things like that. He's been able to forge cells to take different directions than what, you know, natural selection would sort of pre-program, as the assumption is, but sort of looked at it in a different way, applied the theory, and it worked out. And now cells can learn and do their own thing. You know, they can connect to other cells, create hierarchies and communities, and achieve goals collectively, because all intelligence is collective. Yeah, real cells reconnecting with their neighbors versus being dualistic with their neighbors. Right. Working in symbiosis. Symbiotic relationships always work through the spirit of cooperation. In fact, I think that evolution works more through cooperation than in competition and, you know, tooth and claw competition. I think that's part of it, but I think that cooperation is how we ultimately survive as a species, because if you're going to engage in tooth and claw, you would be better off with a team behind you, with a cooperation, or you may be able to avoid it altogether. That'd be the more positive thing to do for survival of species, is to cooperate, but that requires transcendence from that, you know, fight or flight sort of perspective. Yeah, inner body holism. Exactly. Holistically, things work out for the better, don't they? You know, and this is why, you know, for me, non-dualism is not that hard to understand. It's just we know everything through consciousness. So if we're going to take this non-dual approach, then we're going to have to incorporate consciousness as the fundamental, irreducible, primary for understanding and operating within reality and all of that holistically, right? And the problem with that is because it's so counterintuitive to the culture. It goes against everything we've been taught ever since the beginning of Abrahamic religions, that teaches these dualistic us against them, light versus the darkness, creator versus the creation. All of these sort of mindsets go into the language, which forms our concepts and how we operate as a society. And of course, science started with the natural philosophers in the West, and they sort of just inherited, maybe even unconsciously, the language of religion, the dualism. And so the scientific approach was that there's us, and then there's nature. There's us, and there's this other external reality that we have to somehow interact with. And now we have the observer problem in quantum mechanics. I mean, some interpretations like the many worlds theory tries to say that, the observer problem doesn't exist because there are multiple observers in different realities and all of this kind of stuff. But then there's other interpretations that would say the observer problem highlights, the fact that we are part of nature. We are nature. We're the observational part of it. But when we try to separate it, we run into problems. And this becomes the observer problem. But there has to be a theory of the observer, but there is no theory of the observer. Atoms joining up to form cells. Yeah. Just of note, there are non-dual versions of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, but it's seen hidden or occulted until more recent time. Yeah, I was mentioning like the Kabbalah, the different mystical versions of Christianity and stuff. Yeah, they're highly heretical and stuff, and they're less, about orthodoxy and more about orthopraxy, the practice of non-dualism and showing compassion and all of that. Cells joining up to form bowels to create fertilizers for their lovely plant garden friends. Yeah, it all works together. It all works together, man. It's all an amazing thing to me. It's I thought it would be something to bring out because, we all get caught up in our, conversations, us versus them type of conversations. You know what I mean? Like we get caught up in the tribalism and, trying not to understand each other. And I'm just pointing out that, it's cool, man. We can also switch perspectives and it can really grow in our wisdom. We become wiser. We actually become more intelligent when you do that. You engage in steelman debates. I like to steelman other positions. I've been known to take the religious or Christian position to argue against atheism, although I'm kind of an atheist, because I understand the other position and I can interact with it well. The same with physicalism. I've argued for physicalism versus idealism and stuff like that. I've created an entire model with a Substack entry arguing for physicalism as the best worldview. But, that's what I do. I like to look at things in that way. Yeah, it's important to remember physics use the word observer differently. Right. Observer is not consciousness. Observer is, anything that interacts, right? That interacts, but there's no theory for it. And we are observers too. Like the human being that does science is also the observer. And there's no theory for it. So there needs to be a theory that can tie in observers. And Donald Hoffman talks about that too, in separating out consciousness from observers, because you have to do that. Otherwise, it becomes very confusing and over problematic. So it's probably better to parse out those concepts when talking about a theory of observer. Yeah, I agree with you, Nell. In modern physics, observation is synonymous with physical, right? Physical interaction, thermodynamic irreversibility, and information transfer. Right, exactly. Consciousness is fundamental to formulating hypotheses, but it doesn't mean that consciousness is necessarily the substrate from which the material universe arises. Correct. That is correct. That's why it's underdetermined. And, one could argue that, if you did take on idealism, then the reverse problem occurs. You have the hard problem of matter. Why should matter emerge from consciousness? Just like we ask, how does matter or how does consciousness arise or emerge from matter? Now we have the inverse. Now we have the problem of matter arising from consciousness. But as far as I see it, it seems to me that it's an easier explanation to derive matter from consciousness if you look at it as matter is just an appearance of consciousness. In other words, matter is just an experience, and actually it kind of is epistemically. It's all an experience. This experience of solidity, sound, light, all of these things. It's just that they are very real, very measurable, and you can predict upon them. And that's what makes physicalism seem so compelling. But in actuality, when you apply physicalism, that, or physical science, I'd rather say, not physicalism. When you apply physical science, physicalism kind of has more problems, because physicalism would say that all there is the physical and matter, energy. That's all there really is, which, by the way, is not defined. But they would say that it has standalone property. In other words, it'd be standalone existence. But we know that at the Planck scale, it stops being observable. It stops being predicted upon. It stops being all the things we call physical. It just becomes a void. In principle, not just because of lack of tools, just in principle. If you shine so much light along with gravity into a very, very small Planck scale area for fine resolution, you create a black hole. And so just in principle, you cannot measure beyond the Planck scale. And it's a very arbitrary scale. It's not even that far down, according to many. It could go so much farther down, but it doesn't. So it just seems like at a very, pretty arbitrary level, the Planck scale, we stop seeing matter as standalone at all, and the physical as standalone at all. And that's not on idealism, that's on physicalism, or the physical science rather itself. Right? So what are you left with? What are we left with? Is consciousness able to disappear at that Planck scale? Does consciousness disappear? No, consciousness is just fundamental to observing this stuff in that way, right? So you could treat consciousness as fundamental. Like in many models, you can do that. Like with IIT, it's consciousness as a given. And what they're measuring is how it expresses itself through, systems that are integrated, information systems, what it's like to be that integrated system. So the relations are more fundamental than the matter that are relating. There's a relationship. There's a relation between a conscious observer and the thing observed. There's a relation between two unconscious things like, speed and velocity and, matter or observation from one specific locality at a particular speed or whatever. It can be measured differently. There's no hard, fast, ultimate time clock. It's all relative to the position reference frame of the observer, you know. So it seems like the relations seem to be, on a scientific point of view, you know, more fundamental than causation. Causation is the story we tell to make sense of those relations, but those causations appear nowhere in the objects themselves. You know, the causation is a construction of explanation. Useful, but not ontologically real. Hume knew this hundreds and hundreds of years ago. You know, the problem of causation. Observation is quantum transition of wave to wave self-interaction to form a Feynman diagram from the infinitely entangled 0-point field. Yeah, man. Pass me the joint. Matter arises from the consciousness if the infinitely entangled 0-point fields. If relations are fundamental, then one can ask, can consciousness naturally emerge from relations, or does it run into the same problem as physicalism, least concerning the philosophy of mind? Yeah, so if you take an emergent point of view, you're going to run into a problem. How do you get consciousness from relations? I would just say that consciousness is fundamental, that there's what it's like to be the relation in some way. And consciousness is maybe a funny way to put it. It's the experiential field. You know, it's what it's like to be one thing to the other, like like you're registering your place in time. You know, I would say that, you know, maybe the mind-like way you could look at it as far as probability distribution. Like there's all these probabilities that can happen. You know, if these relations are what they are, then there's all these probabilities from which these relations emerge from. And in that way, it's sort of mind-like. It kind of reminds me of Maxwell, or I think it was, Max Planck, who said the matrix of reality is that probability. It's like the mind behind reality, that probability distribution. So it's kind of like a big thought. Like there's all these choices that can be made, and these choices can play out. And that's like the way that reality sort of unfolds, nature unfolds that way, through that probability distribution. And maybe that's the consciousness we're talking about, which is a funny way to describe consciousness, I admit. For me, an observer is a bounded quantum wave interacting with another quantum wave to create transient virtual particles from the 0-point field. Yeah, that's a relation. Like there's a way to look at things, you know, and respond to it. It may be like a very rudimentary form of consciousness when particles interact, you know, because it's responding to an internal and external state of where it is in time and space. Variability, potentiality. Yeah, that's what I was saying. Maybe potentiality is the better word. You know, there's this, I mean, it's called in quantum mechanics a probability distribution, like a field of probability. And you can sort of measure that. And once observed, it will collapse into one of those probabilities. And like on string theory, it would be that all of these probabilities do collapse in some universe on string theory, like the many worlds interpretation. But if that isn't the case, if that's not what's going on, then it just all occurs in one particular reality, one particular bubble. Whereas I think Many Worlds is talking about many bubbles of different timelines and realities and things like that, which makes sense. I mean, there's concise mathematics for it. It's just not proven. But neither is a lot of things that we talk about when it comes to metaphysics, you know? Do you think rocks or atoms have philosophical discussions about the nature of existence? No, I don't believe that, because I'm not a rock and I don't know what it's like to be a rock. I don't think it's a a structure like that. There are a lot of panpsychists that say, well, you know, the cells within the rocks are dynamic and doing things intelligently. You might be able to say that rocks as a composite are not intelligent, but then the mechanisms within the rock are. You can make that argument. But as for consciousness, I don't know. I think that you would have to have a consciousness to have discussions about philosophy. I don't understand why a rock would be having philosophical discussions. That seems a little absurd to me. That's and I admit that's my own cognitive limitation there. It's a conceptual problem. I can't conceive of it, but just because I can't conceive of it doesn't make it not true. But I just can't say I have a reason to believe that it is. Until I have evidence that it is, I just am probably agnostic on that. But I kind of lean towards rocks are not having philosophical discussions. Consciousness is fundamental in the first arrival in science or the first arrival in the universe. I mean, you can make that claim, and I do too, essentially. But when you make that claim, it sounds you got to understand your audience. Most people are going to look at that as unsubstantiated, exaggerated claims. Maybe rocks are just stubborn. No, could be, but maybe rocks are just not integrated information like that. Integrated information has a way to measure consciousness, and it's been helpful in treating coma patients and cognitive problems. And a lot of the integrated information theory is cited in textbooks when it comes to neuroscience and treating a lot of things. There are textbooks that I've seen. I can't tell you about it. I'm not a cognitive science. I don't know much about how it applies. I even forget. But you can measure as far as the integrated information, right? Which is just the relations of systems that are complex enough to do stuff. And if they do enough complicated stuff, then they put like a measurement of experience onto it. And then they make predictions like, if you're a coma patient and then there's this sort of activity going on in this particular part of the brain, then we can say that they're conscious or not, that system is conscious or not, depending. And a lot of those things turned out to work. But I think when they measure things like rock, there's not enough integrated information to really say that a rock is conscious. The field is consciousness. Particles are field quantized communication. Okay. Yeah, I mean, consciousness, I see it as a field. I have like a field of awareness, like my visual field. I can hear. There's an auditory field. I can only hear so far. There's a field of awareness of all my perceptual apparatus. And possibly that's how consciousness works intersubjectively. There's a field of intersubjectivity. Maybe that's grounded in the quantum fields. That would be kind of like a physicalist view of consciousness, but it's totally possible. A rock is a field boundary condition. Yeah, like everything else is a field bound. There's always a boundary. And this is why we get dualism. We pay so much attention to the boundaries and to the distinctions because it's so useful. Otherwise, we'd be bumping in to objects all day long, wouldn't we? It would be problematic, to say the least. The anesthetic efficacy of different isotopes of xenon indicates the quantum origins of consciousness. Yeah, I heard about that, man. Yeah, they have tests that predictions that were met. And this sort of, I think it supported the OR theory of consciousness, which the first hurdle was how do you get quantum phenomena in warm, wet brains, right? How does that happen? But quantum biology is a thing. You have photosynthesis. You have all sorts of quantum tunneling, quantum entanglement that happens in biological systems like birds, and the olfactory senses like smell. There's quantum tunneling, quantum entanglement. All of these things are observed, which gives consciousness a route into the quantum, which makes sense. Hit the like if you enjoy this conversation. Thank you so much. Yeah, man. We need the support, and we need to grow the community so we can have more ideas on the table. I want people, smart people, wise people, people that have different perspectives to join the community and start joining me, man, and expanding. That's what this whole thing is about. It's about learning from one another, and expanding perspectives and understanding each other. It's really cool, man. Particles are free will changes in the imaginary quantum wave. Yeah. Federico Faggin, or however you pronounce his name, he talks about that. And I think he invented like a microchips back in the 80s, certain graphic microchips and stuff for NVIDIA, I think it is. And he's come upon, as a physicist, he lays out models of quantum consciousness. But one of his talking points was the no cloning theorem. But guess what? They've actually overcome the no cloning theorem. I read about that earlier this week. They've actually have a peer-reviewed paper that shows and demonstrates that they've overcome the no cloning theorem in quantum mechanics, which is very interesting. Now, for me, this doesn't really bear so much on idealism, but I guess it does in Faggin's theory, because he's more of a panpsychist kind of view, which is more like a cosmopsychist sort of view. And it talks about how consciousness or information is totally unique, and it's an expression or an excitation of the field. And so we as conscious observers are the field, just being projected into a physical reality. And he has concise mathematics to show it, just like all these other models do. Very interesting stuff, but part of what goes into it is this no cloning theorem. I'm not sure how overturning the no cloning theorem would affect his model. I'm sure he'll be addressing that hopefully soon. But it's pretty interesting. And I like that. I like anything that overturns the apple cart in either direction. Overcome idealism, I'm happy. If you can really show it in a concise way, boy, I'm happy. I think physicalism has enough stuff out there to sort of put a damper on it, but if there's more that can do that, I'm happy. I like anything that can overcome our common ideas, because that just means that we're learning something new, and learning something new appeals to my sense of novelty. But that's just me as an individual. A lot of people don't like that. A lot of people are very conservative when it comes to their beliefs. They like to stick into their views because their identity is tied up in it, Hallucinogenic and anesthetic compounds affect terahertz spin resonance in ubiquitous microtubules in flora and fauna in biology. Yeah, I read about that. In that spin to measure like different rates through some sort of transcranial interaction with the microtubules in the brain, which fulfilled other predictions. Again, it seems like that or is gaining a lot more support through experimentation. And that's very, very interesting. Now, I could see an idealist turn around and say, well, quantum consciousness is just the mechanics of the dream. It's how consciousness appears to work within the greater mind. That's how I could see an idealist interpret that in that view. A physicalist would probably see it as, no, this is fundamentally the way it is. Consciousness is identified with the quantum field. It is the quantum field. The quantum field is consciousness. And then it becomes sort of subtly semantic in a way, because the quantum field is non-local, remember? The quantum field is all entangled. And so aren't we really just saying the same thing at the end of the day? Seems that way. Empathy clones quantum states. Yeah, I can see that in a way. That really makes sense, because you're copying a state of being, a conscious state. And if that can be cloned, if that quantum state or that information can be cloned, it would be cloned as an information state. But the question is whether the experience of what it's like gets cloned as well. How do you clone an experience? Because it seems like an experience is so dynamic that it becomes sort of fundamental to a relationship that's constantly dynamic. And so it's hard to really take a snapshot of consciousness and then say, this is what it's like is now cloned, and we've got it in a drawer. We've got it in our briefcase. This experience itself has been isolated. But I don't know if that's how experience works. As far as I am concerned, it seems like it's an ever elusive thing. I don't think physicalists should run away from emergence, but if emergence is going to be the explanation, that it can't just be a placeholder like dark matter, right? And because that's what it is. And for me, emergence is just a perspective of consciousness. It's correlation. It's what the correlation looks like. And they call it emergence, but that's sort of a hand wave. Strong emergence is a hand wave, you know what I mean? And when you think about like, well, wetness from H2O and all that is emergent, but wetness is a qualia state. Wetness is a description of what it's like to feel water. It feels wet. There is no wet out there on physicalism. So how could wetness be an emergent property of physical things? It would just be another physical thing. But wetness is a qualia state. That's what confuses me about that story of emergence. There has to be more than a surface level explanation, right? Well, it's more like not even an explanation. Emergence is the opposite of an explanation. It's just a word that's supposed to make it go away. It's like a magic word. When you don't understand something, just say God done it or emergence done it. These are just labels and words to explain things away, not necessarily explain things. Spin and orientation are quantum variables linked by the uncertainty principle. I think so. The universe is fractal, holistic. I see that too. All of that stuff for me is has actually been described mathematically. If you look at the work of Leonard Susskind, he talks about that fractal holism through what he calls the holographic principle. It's a principle in science that explains information theory and how information is never lost. but it's actually sitting on the boundary of a black hole, like a singularity. But if that's the case, he says that can be actually applied equally to reality itself, because if we're talking about our local representation of the universe came from a singularity, then the same principle can hold. And so everything that we experience as physical reality is simply a projection from the information state of that singularity. It's just sitting around the boundary. You know, I agree with that too. That makes sense to me as well. I think it's all sort of converging on some of the same non-dualistic kind of perspectives, man. All of these theories and models are just pointing to just different ways of describing the same thing. Just say wetness emerges from right. A wetness emerges from consciousness, exactly, because it's an experience. Experience arises from awareness, you know, or consciousness, awareness, consciousness. That's right. That's why I say it's so hard to get behind it. It's almost impossible for us to get behind consciousness to really talk about ontology. That's the problem. That's the hard problem of consciousness too. Not only just why is there an experience that correlates at all, but how do you get behind consciousness to even talk about what's fundamental to it? In that case, it seems just as valid to say it's conscious, right? Consciousness is the fundamental thing. That's kind of how I lean. I don't want to say I believe it because, you know, I don't want to get caught up in, you know, being committed to anything. I'm not much of a joiner, you know what I mean? But I am a genuine person. Like I'm, you know, I try to be honest about what I believe and think. And I know beliefs are just part of being a human. Can't get around it. I'm not going to sit there and say, oh, I'm above beliefs and I'm above my ego. And I don't want to be fake, man. I want to go ahead and admit, you know, I have beliefs. But I like to acknowledge that they're just that. They're just beliefs. I don't think that's impossible, is it? Can we go ahead and that we're kind of constrained by beliefs? And I believe in free will, but I also don't believe in free will on some aspects. But I look both ways when I cross the street. I make decisions and choices as though I have free will every day. So can I really say I don't have beliefs about free will? Of course I do. I act on them every day. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing this show right now, right? So, yeah, I mean, it is what it is. God is consciousness. Yeah, you can say that. That's why I say I don't have a problem with God when you just, if you define it in such ways, because if God is non-dual, is the non-dual reality, then yeah, sure. Because that's all I know is my own conscious experience. And it's not very hard for me to make that leap, which is a kind of leap that ontologically everything is consciousness or everything is owned by consciousness. I mean, it's not hard to make that leap. But I can admit that it's just another model. It's just another exercise of my mind at work. But honestly, that's the way that makes sense to me. I can't help it. And I try really hard to understand the alternative views, but it's just hard not to keep coming back to some form of idealism. I would say like an integrated idealism, because I do acknowledge the dualism. I do acknowledge the physical as objectively real. I don't have full access to it, but I do have access to it through my interface. So I do see the physical as real, and I do see the duality as real, but I see it all arising within a conscious primordial sort of substance, if you will, if you even want to call it a substance. Maybe it's more like a probability or potentiality field or something like a mind like that, like a very rudimentary mind, like a matrix mind or something like that, you know, something's got to tie it all together. You know, I can't go with physicalism because it just doesn't tie it together. We still have the hard problem of consciousness. We have the hard problem of strong emergence. You know, I can't get around that. I'm not going to sit there and pretend like these things aren't problems. And those are enough major problems to make me just kind of put physicalism on the back burner for now, until somehow we can get around these problems. What about the Planck scale problem? The fact that the physical stops being that describable at the Planck scale in principle. How do I explain that if I'm a physicalist? Like, there's so many problems I'm looking at I would have to contend with. And I have no way around it, if I'm being honest. I can just wave it off and ignore it like a lot of people do. Some people just don't want to talk about it. Like I said, I've called into some of these atheist skeptic channels to talk about it with people like Matt Dillahunty and Forrest Valkai and all these people. And for them, they just, when I bring up these problems, it's almost like they don't really acknowledge it. They just say, yeah, just for now. But I mean, at the end of the day, it's all just physicalism. Like, if you're going to ignore the problem, then why should I just believe you? You're not really engaging with the problem. You're just sort of hand waving it away. And isn't that what religious people do? When you bring up problems of evil, divine hiddenness, the fact that we don't have empirical evidence for the God, you know, it's almost like, yeah, but that's not really a problem. I mean, they just sort of, they treat it the same way. They just sort of hand wave it all away. Like, I understand, but it's not really as big of a deal as you think it is. But for me, it is. For me, it is. Yeah, we are all sure of consciousness. We are. But, you know, some people say that there is no, I've had a lot of conversations, let me tell you. There are people that say consciousness isn't really a thing at all. We just think we're conscious. But we're not, because consciousness isn't real at all. We just think it is. But my problem with that is you have to be conscious to think about anything, even the idea of no conscious. You have to be conscious. So that kind of doesn't make sense to me. Consciousness, quantum field that God creates the universe, right? Going to head out to lunch. If this ends before I get back, we'll hope you all have a wonderful day. Thanks, Nell. Appreciate you. And we'll see you soon. I'm going to give this up in a little bit. I've got to eat lunch, man, eventually. Yeah, so it's for me, it's this is what leads me, if it, you know, because people ask me about non-dualism and idealism, you know, all the time. And it seems like in a lot of ways, there's just kind of a misunderstanding, even as subtle as it is. It's sort of semantic, but I just like to make it clear and talk about it and get feedback and other ideas. And I agree with all you guys, even, you know, people that don't agree with the non-dualism. I agree with you in ways that it makes sense. I can understand you. Consciousness resides in the dimension provided by imaginary numbers in mathematics. Oh, yeah, you're talking about the Platonic field. Well, that's one way to look at it. I'm not really sure. But maybe we're all saying the same thing. I just don't understand, because we all describe things different, use different words. But Michael Levin does also talk about this Platonic field of dynamic interactions and identities and tokens, if you will, that all of these sort of ways of novelty and problem solving and becoming are sort of like expressed through bioelectric fields. which are rooted in Platonic fields. He talks about that. And, it's a perspective. And, it's one way to look at stuff. You know what I mean? Hand waving. Yeah. Hand waving for me is when you have a belief or a conclusion. You don't really know how to explain it. So you just sort of import it as almost like a placeholder, like dark matter, dark energy, emergent, like strong emergence. It's just sort of a label we put on stuff to explain things we don't understand. And for me, that's magical thinking. If you take it serious, that is. I'm not saying it's magical thinking as a possibility. And who knows, magic may be true. We may live in a magical universe. And that emergence is how it looks like when the magic occurs. So I don't know. I'm not really upset if it turned out that was really the case. All consciousness has reasons for their perspectives. Yeah, I say the reasons are part of it anyways, is the relational aspect of reality. The asymmetry in nature. Or nature itself, the nature of reality, is to be asymmetric. There's this and that. There's that duality at play, that dance. And consciousness is what it's like. And consciousness comes in, so many different, expressions, all based in those different, relative positions. Like that rock. That rock, if it is conscious, then that's like one relative perspective, from the rock's point of view. All right, Stephen G, man. Thank you, man. Bye. We'll see you later. Thanks for interacting and everything like that. I'm going to probably get ready to bounce out myself. I've kind of spent myself on this topic. I don't want to bore everybody. But if you like these conversations, like and subscribe. Next week, on the weekend, me and Sophia, we're going to talk about Marquette with Bryce again. We'll kind of react to some of his videos, and this has to do with social ideology and stuff like that. So we'll talk about all that stuff. Magic Disappearing Act. Yep, we'll see you guys next time, man. Thank you for your participation. I appreciate everything. And till then, we'll see you. Be good. Have a great Sunday.